Well, as we read earlier, we're going to be in Luke chapter 20, which is on page 930 of the Church Bible. So if you've got one, do turn there. That might well be helpful. And we're going to spend most of the evening thinking about what Jesus teaches in this parable of the vineyard and the wicked vine dressers. But we're also going to consider a little bit about what happened just before that, and also some words that Jesus says shortly after he gives the parable. Now, on a Monday morning, on the 1st of January, just a few weeks from now, people up and down the country are going to wake up and say to themselves, out with the old, in with the new. As 2017 comes to an end, people will be making all sorts of New Year's resolutions. I wonder if some people in here have some in mind that they would like to make. Some will want to do more exercise, some to pass all their exams, others to spend more time with people who are important to them, like friends and families. Lots of people will be saying about their lives, things need to change. And I think that is what Jesus is saying to us in this parable. That's what he's saying to the people that are listening to him here in Luke, and it's what we need to hear as well. Apparently, 90% of the New Year's resolutions that are made fail most years. But what Jesus has done, the change that he has made, the one that he's talking about here, still affects us today. You see, we try to make a change when a new year starts, but when Jesus made the change that he's talking about here, most of the world got a new calendar. So this evening, we're going to look in and see what has he done? What changes has he made? And I think as we look at this parable and the words that follow, what we're going to see is that they give us a little bit of a Bible overview. They tell us a lot about God's relationship with people, as we see it in the Old Testament, in his relationship with Israel, and into the New Testament as Jesus comes and he starts to relate to all people in the way that he relates to Israel as his people and as his nation. And so we see that at the start of the parable, we're told that there's a vineyard and that there are people in charge of looking after it. And I think as we look at these vine dressers who are supposed to care for it, they're like farmers who should look after it, we will be reminded of what things were like in the nation of Israel as their leaders, who are the vine dressers, were supposed to look after God's people there. And then the son being sent towards the end of the parable takes us into the Gospels and Jesus coming to Israel, God's vineyard, God's people. But just like the son in the parable, he is rejected and killed by the leaders, who are the vine dressers in the parable. And the parable ends in the tragedy of his death, but thankfully, Jesus follows the parable with some more teaching. He gives us this teaching about the cornerstone. And here I think he's telling us that his death isn't the end of the story. Here he's giving us a message of hope that goes beyond the tragic murder of the son of the owner of the vineyard. And it's helpful to remember that this is all happening really soon before Jesus dies. He has just come into Jerusalem, and within the next week, things are really going to come to a head, and he's going to be crucified. And the big question for us this evening is, will we accept Jesus, or will we reject him? Perhaps the key verse for us comes as Jesus speaks after the parable in verse 17, and he quotes from the Old Testament and says, "The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Will we accept him or reject him?" We'll have a think about what that looks like a little bit later on. So the plan, first of all, is to look at God and Israel. We're going to see how the vine dressers rejected the owner and didn't look after the vineyard as they could. And we're going to think about how that's seen in the Old Testament. And then we're going to look at Jesus' arrival, which we see here in this part of Luke and in the Gospels and in what he does. And then we're going to look at God and the church and the new way of doing things, which is built on Jesus, the cornerstone. and is possible because of the gospel that he fulfills. And then finally, we'll finish with some thoughts about how we respond to all of this. So first of all, God and Israel. What do we know about the relationship between God and the vineyard, that is the people of Israel, and the vine dressers, who were the religious leaders in Israel, a bit like the religious leaders that Jesus is encountering here? And we see similar kinds of leaders in the Old Testament who were supposed to lead God's people. And we'll see what actually leads to this encounter between Jesus and these people, which is a bit of a showdown, isn't it? What has led to this? What has caused Jesus to come and to say something needs to change? So God is the owner. The vineyard are the people of Israel. And this is something that they will have heard as Jesus spoke and believed, because a lot of the times in the Old Testament, the Israelite nation is compared to a vineyard. One example of that comes in Isaiah 5, where God talks about how he has planted a vineyard and cared for it and looked after it. And the vine dressers, that means farmers, as we said, those are the religious leaders who should have cared for the people and who should have brought the people's and their own sacrifices and their good works and their praise up towards God. This is what they were there for. And the nation of Israel was chosen by God, not because they were great, but because he wanted a people who would know him and live for him and show others his greatness. They were chosen by him and put in a great place so they could produce fruit for him. In Isaiah 5, God asks, as he looks at the vineyard, what more could have been done for my vineyard than I have already done for it? And yet, as we see here in Luke and in this parable, the vines weren't producing good fruit because the vine dressers weren't doing their job. You see, first of all, they didn't actually care for the vines. A lot of the time, as we look through the Old Testament and see the religious leaders, and as we look here in the Gospels and see the religious leaders at the time, we see that they didn't care for the people of God. Instead, they took fruit that was produced, and they either kept it for themselves and hoarded it together in their greed, or they ruined it. And instead of leading the people to God and showing them how to live lives for him and what that would look like, they got in the way. They blocked the way between them and God. And in fact, in a way, they replaced God with themselves, so that the people would look at them and think they're great, they're impressive, and would lose sight of God, who they really should have been living to please. Secondly, we see that these vine dressers rejected prophets that God had sent. These are the servants sent by the owner of the vineyard in the parable. 1, 2, 3 servants sent, and all of them are rejected and thrown out. This is also what we see when we look into the nation of Israel, as we see it in the Old Testament. Moses wasn't trusted by his people. Elijah had to run for his life. Jeremiah was thrown in a sewer and persecuted for bringing the word of God to the people. John the Baptist, another prophet sent, was beheaded. All of these men were sent by God in order to turn the people to him and to help them live for him. But the Jewish leaders, the Israelite leaders, rejected them and persecuted them. And I think what we see as we look at those examples is that it wasn't just one generation of the people that was the problem. It was the hearts of all of the people that were the problem. And as long as God's people were led by leaders like this, things weren't going to go well. They weren't going to live for him and serve him and produce fruit for him as he wanted them to. They weren't being cared for, and they weren't living the fruitful lives that God wanted to see them living. And finally, we see that the Israelite leaders killed the son who was finally sent after the prophets. You see, they should have been anticipating Jesus. They should have been looking forward to his coming because they had been told that the Son was coming and was going to turn them to God. And he was going to ask for their devotion and their trust. And they should have anticipated him. They should have sung, O come, Emmanuel, when they met together. But they didn't. Instead, when he really did come, they hated him. They hated his coming because of what it meant for them. It looks like they liked things as they were when they were in control, when they were the most important people. Like the vine dressers in our parable, the religious leaders wanted the inheritance for themselves. And when the Son finally came in the name of the owner, they proved to be willing to do anything to stay in control. Jesus came to them and asked them to be humble and to submit to him because he had come in the name of God his Father, and they hated that. That was what they hated about Jesus, and that was what led them to kill him. And that's what we see in a couple of places as Jesus speaks this parable. Just after he cleanses the temple, which just happened before he spoke this parable, we see in chapter 19, verse 47, that the chief priests, the scribes, and the leaders of the people sought to destroy him. And in the same way, after he's spoken the parable, in verse 19 of chapter 20, again, the chief priests and the scribes that very hour sought to lay hands on him. You see, Jesus came in the name of the Father, the owner of these people, and they hated him for it. And so as we look at those examples from the Old Testament, we see that it wasn't just these religious leaders who met Jesus like this face to face, who had failed to bring fruit to God and who wanted the inheritance for themselves. Sadly, it had been like this for a very long time. In fact, in Israel, in God's vineyard, to some degree, it had always been like this. Now, it's true that there were many who did live for God, who trusted him, and there were some who believed the prophets that were sent, who remembered God as the owner of the vineyard and listened to those prophets. But overall, far too many of the religious leaders proved themselves to be unable to look after and care for this vineyard that is the people of Israel faithfully. And Jesus finds fault with this generation, and that's the climax of finding fault with many people like this. You see, Jesus didn't just happen to come at the only bad time. Yes, it was a bad time in the nation's history, but it wasn't the first time that this has started happening. So we can see from Jesus' encounters with the leaders at this stage, and also from the examples of God sending his prophets and how many of the religious leaders dealt with them, we can see that there needed to be a new way for the people to live for God and to bear fruit for him. The owner lending the vineyard to these leaders has not produced the fruit that he wanted to see. And so he set out to put in place a new plan, a new agreement. And God, the owner, knew this. He knew this was needed. And we're told in Hebrews, God found fault with the people and said, I will make a new covenant, a new way of relating to my people. And so we see that it was never what God had done, what the owner had set in place that was the problem. It was the people who were the problem. And that new covenant mentioned in Hebrews chapter 8 is the gospel that Jesus brings that allows us to know him and live for him forever. It's explained to us in the New Testament, and here in Luke 20, Jesus is predicting it, or at least giving us a hint that it's going to come true. But we'll come to that a little bit later as we look at what he says about him being the cornerstone. So this is the situation that Jesus has come into, a very tense moment where the religious leaders of the day, like many who had gone before them, look at the man who God has sent and do not want to hear from him and want to kill him. But that takes us to our second point, which is that Jesus did come. He did arrive like the son in this parable who was sent. I wonder if any people have seen the very famous picture that happened in China whenever someone was protesting against military tanks going up an empty road, and there must have been 20 or 30 tanks, one after the other, and one man just walks in front of them with his shopping bags and stands in front of them. The perfect picture of someone standing up against the establishment. And that's what Jesus is doing here. He's coming into the heart of what shouldn't have been enemy territory, but he's coming in here and he's standing up to what is wrong. And with this parable, the parable of the vineyard, Jesus is explaining what is happening around him in that very moment. He's explaining what's going wrong when he went into the temple and had to clear it out. What's going wrong as the people, the religious leaders, question him and don't trust him. With the parable, he's explaining all of this. And I think it's worth us seeing that Jesus' mission was always going to climax here in the temple and in Jerusalem. You see, this was a picture of the heart of Israel's way of life as they looked to live as God people. It was the place where their relationship with God was to be made clear for all to see. Let me read you a few verses in Luke which show us that Jesus' mission was always taking him to this place, to this great showdown with the establishment. So in Luke 9, verse 51, and people sometimes say this is a verse that almost hinges the whole book and changes the direction of it, and really where Jesus starts going towards his crucifixion and death. 9:51 says, when the days drew near for him to be taken up to heaven, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. In chapter 19, verse 28, when he had said this, when Jesus had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. 19:41, as he drew near, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, if you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for peace. And then at the start of the verses that we read this evening, chapter 19, verse 45, then he went into the temple and began to drive out those who bought and sold in it, saying to them, my house is a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves. You see, the temple wasn't supposed to be enemy territory, but for him, as it was for the prophets, it had become that. You see, here Israel and the leaders were supposed to be doing what God had asked of them. He wanted sacrifices from their hearts, encouraged by the leaders. And the verses that Jesus quotes from Isaiah show us what the problem was. You see, those verses tell us that God wanted prayer from the people along with burnt offerings and sacrifice. But instead, what was happening in the temple at the time was that the leaders were keeping the fruit for themselves. People had come to Jerusalem so that they could give their sacrifices to God, but they had to go through this marketplace in the outer courtyard. And here, on their way, they were being cheated as they exchanged and bought and sold so that the religious leaders could gain more for themselves. See, they had control of this area, and they were using it for their own advantage. When Jesus finally came to Jerusalem and finally came to the temple, he went in and he found a sham. And him coming to the temple was just like the son arriving in the vineyard in the parable that he speaks about. He was looking for sacrifices and prayer towards God the owner, but instead he found the leaders, the religious leaders, hoarding for themselves. They were acting as though they owned the place, as though they owned the vineyard and all that came with it. And after he had went into the temple and seen this, he has this conversation where they question him in verses 1 to 8 of chapter 20. They question his authority, And this is like the vine dressers deciding what to do about the son. The same heart issue is going on. You see, the religious leaders don't say here publicly that they know Jesus comes on the authority of the Father, but on some level they knew he did. And just like the farmers in the parable, they say, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, that the inheritance will be ours." And this is exactly what we see in the verses that we read earlier, like verse 19 of chapter 20, where they look to lay hands on him. You see, throughout his ministry, Jesus asked, he demanded that people offer all they have to him as their way of giving all they have to the Father. And how did people respond? Has it failed? Has the Son, like the prophets, come and not got what he was looking for? Is the relationship over between the people of Israel and God, their owner? Well, the answer, as we know, is no. It wasn't over, because there was another way. And that way is built on Jesus, the cornerstone. And that takes us to our third point, where we'll think about God and how he relates to the church, built on Jesus, our cornerstone. When the New Testament writers mention the gospel, they often emphasize something that changed when Jesus came. That the whole world, Gentiles, not just people who were ethnically from Israel, can now believe in Jesus and be God's people. Ephesians 3 and Colossians 1 are two places that talk about this, and they talk about how glorious it is and how privileged we are to even know about it, as many of even the prophets who were faithful and who were sent didn't know. They didn't know that this was going to happen like this. So the parable that Jesus tells here is ongoing. And it climaxes with the death of the Son being sent. And we know that that climax is coming very soon in the book of Luke and in Jesus' life. Just days away, in fact, as we said. And Jesus knows this as he's speaking. Doesn't that show us the great commitment that he has to his people, and the love that he has for them, and the love that the owner has for them? And all of this, we can't miss verses 13 and 14, where we're shown what the owner of the vineyard was thinking when he sent his son. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Probably they will respect him when they see him." Here we see the attitude of the owner towards the vineyard, towards his people, even after all these years. You see, the owner of the vineyard never stopped loving it. He never stopped loving his people, and he simply would not turn away from it. And so Jesus came to Israel. He came saying who he was, who had sent him, and he was killed. But, praise God, the story hasn't finished there. Instead, we see that the murderers are judged for what they have done, and the vineyard is taken from them. And hearing this makes the religious leaders of the day say, "Certainly not." And I think what shocks them is the idea that the owner would take the vineyard and take it away from them. You see, they thought that they were the most important people and that everything depended on them. But they're being shown by Jesus here that actually God's got another way. And of course, the heart of that other way is Jesus himself. He is the cornerstone that God's people are built on. And so Jesus moves away from the parable and he gives us this verse from the Old Testament: "The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone." And he's explaining here how people can know and live for God, the owner. So in these verses following the parable, Jesus is just telling us a little bit about this new way, this new plan. That's the verse to memorize if you want one this evening. The stone the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Because the Son who was sent and who was rejected has become the cornerstone. Here in this part of Luke, Jesus is predicting his death and his rejection, but he's also predicting his resurrection and how we can place our hope in him because of that. You see, he is the cornerstone. The cornerstone was the foundation of the building. It wasn't just another fairly important stone. It was the one that everything else depended on. And all of God's people depend on Jesus, on the Messiah who God sent. Whether it was the people of the Old Testament who looked forward to his coming, or it was the people of his day who saw him and believed in him, or if it's us who have seen him and heard of him and have believed in him, we can all have a relationship with God and can live with him because of Jesus, the cornerstone. Him coming means that all of us can be brought in. So some have rejected him and will be judged for that, but others believe in him. And this is the glorious good news. We have been included because the Father and the Son didn't give up on humanity when the Son arrived and found a sham. If he came for Israel, he stayed for the world. So people like you and I, who naturally have no part in this great story, can believe in Jesus and build our lives on him and can know God through him. And it's good to think about ourselves as outsiders who have been brought in. Perhaps we take it for granted a little bit too much because it seems like it's been such a long time since this new way came into place. But actually, we need to remember that it's only possible because Jesus came with the gospel and because he came as the cornerstone. You see, we are now God's vineyard, and we can build our lives on Jesus. Ephesians 2 in the New Testament is one place that helps us remember this. So Paul the Apostle writes there in chapter 2 from verse 19. He says, "You Gentiles are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people, and also members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone." And so Jesus came and he said, "Israel, you must accept me as the cornerstone." But he also looked away from Israel and said, "Gentiles, outsiders, come in as well. Believe in me as the cornerstone." And so our question now as we finish up is, how do we actually respond to all of this? You see, this parable isn't just given so that we can see a brief history, a very brief history of God's relationship with humanity. Instead, Jesus spoke it in the temple to the people then, and he speaks it now to us in order to challenge us. He's looking for a response. He's asking us, will we reject him or will we accept him? You see, there's no middle option. You can't say, well, I'll accept him as quite a good stone, but I'll put him over here in not such an important place in my life. No, either we reject him completely or we'll build all our hope and all our lives on him and live for him and live for God the Father who sent him. Either you reject him completely or you build on him completely. So for anyone in here who hasn't accepted him, we are warned, aren't we, in verse 18, that whoever falls on that stone will be broken. But on whomever it falls, it will grind him to powder. You see, Jesus came because he wanted people to believe in him. He wants us to accept him. But he does say you will stumble on him, you will fall, you will be crushed if you don't believe him. He doesn't want this. He doesn't want you to stumble any more than he wanted the Israelite leaders to stumble on him. Instead, do you remember what he said as he was coming into Jerusalem, into the city, knowing that many there were going to reject him? We were told there that as he drew near Jerusalem, he saw the city and wept over it. And he comes to us and he says, it's not too late for you to accept me and believe in me. So ultimately, this parable isn't just a challenge to the religious leaders and others who were listening at this stage in Luke. It's a challenge to all of us. It firstly tells us about those who rejected him there and in the past, as we saw in the Old Testament. But all of that gives us a picture of how all of humanity has rejected Jesus. That's what we see whenever we see people not accepting Jesus, not accepting the prophets and God's word. That's what all humanity has done. It wasn't just the people in Israel. This desire to own the vineyard for themselves is what has gone wrong in all of our hearts. We all want to own our own lives and to live on this planet without offering anything to God. But now the owner has sent his Son to all of us so that we could believe in him and live our lives for God instead of ourselves. And what more could he do for us? If you think about nothing else this Christmas, think about that. The fact that God sent his Son so that we could know him and live for him. And Christian, if you believe in him, you are building your life on him. Remember that you were an outsider who has been brought in to know God only because of what Jesus has done. He was willing to go through rejection and death to make sure we would know God and bear fruit for him. This is what he wants from us, and we should be glad to give it to him. We should be excited about living our lives for this reason rather than as though we own our lives. So are we offering up our whole lives? That's the sacrifice that he wants from us today, to give up our whole lives for him, not to hold anything to ourselves. Are we willing to live entirely for Jesus? Or are there areas in our life and things that we have that we don't want him to ask for? Things that we don't want him to intrude upon? Do we ever think about our lives that way? Any plans we have that we don't want to surrender to his will? Hopefully this parable helps us see, and the quote about our building our lives on the cornerstone helps us see that all of our life is Jesus by right. And are we living and doing good works for him as well? Whatever opportunities we have to serve and to please him, are we doing them for him and not for ourselves? Or are we just trying to enjoy the gifts and opportunities that we have for our own gain? We don't want to be like this, and we don't have to be if we're building our lives on Jesus. So no matter where you are now, no matter how much you think you do or don't have to offer God, remember that Jesus has come so that we could accept him. He who was rejected has become the cornerstone for anyone who is willing to build their lives on him. Amen.